Hello, everyone. How nice was that to see that wonderful reaction happening right in front of your eyes? Maybe quite quickly for some folks, over a few hours, and your balloon keeps growing, right? A lovely, lovely experiment showing one of the very important processes that's there in life. Both plants and animals happen to respire this way, as you saw, and it's there in a lot of what we do in our day-to-day life. Look what I have here, and this wonderful plate here. Okay, what is that? Piece of bread, right? Hmm, very tasty. And what's here? Yogurt or curd, whatever you want to call it. Hmm, both very tasty. Go well together sometimes. I know it's not a very common combination, bread and yogurt, but try it out. So it works pretty good. And if the yogurt is slightly sweetened, then even better. Okay, two lovely items that we have every day. Both have a slightly sourish tinge taste, and of course you'll also hear that they're good for health. They have these things. Or you have probiotics. Curd is better than having milk directly. It's easier to digest. Bread is very nice, fluffed up. You heard the word fermented dough, and we all enjoy a good slice of bread, good toast, or sandwiches, or pizza, all made from fermented dough. And then, of course, in Indian cuisine, we have a whole range of things that are beautifully fermented. In the south, you get fantastic fermented dough to make your idlis and dosas. My favorite food, some of my favorite foods are fermented foods, like dosas. They're irresistible. Okay, so it's very much a part of our life. We can think about how this happens, how it's similar to the experiment you've done, and I hope you've enjoyed doing it and are looking forward to connect it with some real life examples, with some concepts, and how it'll help you understand this process, this way of animals and even some plants breathing and respiring to do what they did to your balloon in the stuck on top of your bottle. Yeah. So I'll just share a short presentation with all of you right now, and hopefully over the next half an hour or so, you answer enough questions, you ask enough questions in the chat window, and we'll be happy to help you out, answer your questions at the end of the session, and interact that way as well, right? So I'll just start a small presentation right now for this wonderful activity, respiration anaerobic. And my name is Procheta, and this presentation was made by my colleague Shilpa, and we'll have some fun enjoying what she's presented here in these slides, and ask some good questions. Just to recap your memory, we will look at the experiment again as a video. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed seeing that, and can now look at the observation tables that you have already been presented. Hopefully you've already done the experiment. So this is just to recap that and help you maybe answer some of the poll questions, observation questions that will come up. So what are the three setups that we prepare? Setup 1, that has 3 grams of sugar, 2 grams of yeast. All the setups have about 150 milliliters of water. In the second setup, we increase the amount of sugar by a factor of 3, keep the same amount of yeast. And in the third setup, we go back to the 3 grams of sugar, but increase the amount of yeast by a factor of 3 to about 6 grams. And we try and see what impact this has on the inflation of the balloon. Okay, so in a given amount of time, what is the size, what is the circumference of the balloon after 1 hour, 2 hours, and 3 hours? That's what you have to measure. Okay, so that's what you have to fill out in the boxes here in the table below. So obviously in 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hour, the size increases for all three. And where does it increase the fastest? That's for you to figure out and see and tell us what you have observed. Okay, so that's the first observation. In the second one, we keep all the ones for the same amount of time, all the setups for the same amount of time, and which one has grown the most in size. Here you're going to actually measure the volume of that balloon. And how do we do that? We can do that by displacing some water from a filled up uh, uh, utensil with water, and you submerge the balloon fully. Whatever water falls out, that you can measure in a measuring cup or cylinder, and you should get a volume of the water that has been displaced. The other way to do it is, if you have a graduated cylinder that's transparent, you can keep it at a particular height and submerge the balloon fully and see how much the height increases. So the change in the volume also tells you the how much the volume of that balloon is. So that's what you're supposed to do in the second set of observations. Then you're asked another couple of interesting ones where you have to smell what's inside the bottle. So obviously take out the balloon and smell it. Don't keep smelling it too long. Just do a quick sniff and see what smell you get from that fermented mixture of yeast and sugar. And if you want to observe the property of the gas further, what's collected in the balloon, you can pass that through into us. For example, you can collect some lime water. What is lime? Lime is calcium oxide or tuna whitewash. Okay, it has all these names. Quicklime, you can get it in most shops, and some people will already have it in their house. So it's nothing but whitewash. It's different from chalk. This is whitewash. It's calcium oxide is the chemical compound. You put a little bit of that with water and you get a clear solution by filtering that. Now to that filtered clear solution, you say put it in a test tube, and on top of the test tube you can put this balloon. Okay, that's still inflated with the gas from that bottle that you worked with earlier on. So let that gas enter this test tube, shake it a little bit so that the gases exchange between the test tube and the balloon, and you'll find, or should find, that the clear calcium oxide water, which is nothing but calcium hydroxide, that turns milky white, and that proves that the gas is something. Okay, so let's go ahead and answer the first poll question, which is the observation, remember, from the first table I showed you. So this is reiterated here. Setup 1 has a bottle filled with 3 grams of sugar and 2 grams of yeast. Setup 2 has 10 grams of sugar and 2 grams of yeast. Setup 3 has again 3 grams of sugar, but here it says 10 grams of yeast. Okay, but it can be 6 grams as we had shown in the observation table. In each case, 150 ml of water is used, so the same amount of water. After 3 hours, in which setup was the balloon filled with the maximum amount of gas? Which balloon, which setup had the maximum size? Okay, so I'll give you 5 more seconds to answer this one. This was a if you've done the experiment, then it's a very obvious and easy one. we'll end the poll there. And I think all of you would have observed that it was setup 3 where the yeast was significantly increased from setup 1. Sugar was kept the same, that had the biggest balloon size. Okay. What can we infer from this observation? So why did balloon 3 grow, setup 3 grow to the maximum size? Is it because the amount of yeast impacts more than the sugar for the amount of liberation of gas? Is it both the amount of sugar and yeast impact equally? Is it because the quantity of gas released depends upon the room temperature? Or is it because the amount of sugar impacts the amount of liberation of gas? We have 5 seconds for you to answer this one. Yeah, so we'll close the poll there. And obviously, since you saw that the one with the yeast, where that was increased compared to the sugar, that showed the maximum impact on the size of the balloon. You can say that the amount of yeast impacts more than the amount of sugar. Okay, and that is what we observe when we are doing the experiment in a short amount of time. We'll talk about later where that gas is coming from, but initially it seems like yeast is what is responsible for the faster or the bigger amount of gas liberation. Okay. This is a question that's next. In which setup did the balloon reach its maximum size the fastest? So not only which one grew to the maximum size, but which one grew the fastest. Okay, so another 5 seconds for this. We'll end the poll there, and I think that's a pretty obvious one. You'll say, oh, what's the difference between fastest and biggest? But we found that setup 3, it did grow the fastest as well, and that's where the real value of yeast comes in. Okay, what do you conclude from the observation that setup 3's balloon grew the fastest? Is it more the quantity of yeast faster the reaction? Is it more the quantity of sugar slower the reaction? Or is it quantity of yeast should be more than sugar for a fast reaction? What do you infer from this observation? I'll give 5 more seconds for this one. And we can close the poll there. And here too, it is more the quantity of yeast, faster the reaction. Okay, and that is where the amount of yeast really matters or makes a difference. Why is that? Because yeast happens to be what is doing the digestion of the sugar here, right? It is eating the sugar and it is respiring and it's producing some gas while doing that form of respiration. We'll talk a little bit more about respiration as we go ahead, but that seems to be what's happening. Where does that gas come from? Does it come from the yeast? Does it come from the sugar? Does it come from the water? That maybe in a little while we'll figure that out, right? And this is what gets us to this whole thing of respiration and what is it when we are relating it to, say, breathing. So this is just a quick poll question to figure out what your understanding is about breathing and respiration. Are they the same thing? Are they different? Okay, so you have a multiple choice question here. More than one answer may be correct. So go ahead, read this and choose your correct answers. So option A, yes, breathing and respiration are two words that mean the same thing. Option B, no, they are different, but both breathing and respiration happen only in living things. Option C, not the same, but they are related. Respiration happens in cells, while breathing happens in a particular set of organs of plants and animals. And D, breathing and respiration are not related. So which of these one or more answers is options is correct? Go ahead and make your choice. I'll give you 10 more seconds. We'll close the poll here and you'll notice that both answers B and C describe the comparison between respiration and breathing quite well. So option A is wrong. Yes, breathing and respiration are two words that mean the same thing. They're not exactly the same thing. So that's why option A is incorrect. And option D, breathing and respiration are not related, is also incorrect. They are related. So option B says they are different, but both breathing and respiration happen only in living things. That's very true. We in fact even define something being alive when it respires or breathes, okay, which happens to be plants and animals, to put it quite simply. Both do both. And C, not the same, but they are related. Yeah, so they are not exactly the same, but they are related. Respiration happens in cells, okay, and we'll talk about that soon, whereas breathing happens in a particular set of organs of plants and animals. Okay, so B and C are the correct descriptions to this question. So what is breathing? That act right there. Breathing in oxygen in the air, breathing out carbon dioxide does come out, oxygen also comes out, and there's our air atmosphere on earth has a huge amount of nitrogen which goes in and comes out without doing much inside. What happens to the 21% of oxygen that's in the air? That goes in and gets absorbed in our lungs into our bloodstream. We have this lovely blood that has something called hemoglobin, which loves oxygen. So there's a transfer that happens there in the lungs. Okay, they perform that extremely crucial role, and then that blood goes throughout our body thanks to our heart pumping blood across our body, and our cells are doing a lot of work. Okay, and they do what is called respiration in some sense, right? So respiration includes breathing, but it also includes this whole process of the oxygenated blood going to the cells having some reaction there and releasing this gas called carbon dioxide, and then that comes back into the lungs and you breathe it out. So just breathing is a simple act of breathing in, breathing out. We are doing that several times a second. You won't say you're respiring 8 times a minute or whatever it is. You'll say you're breathing, you're taking in a breath, inhaling and exhaling uh, 8 or 10 times a minute. But when you're respiring, it's what's happening in your body once you've taken that oxygen in. So how is that oxygen used in our body, and how is that, what is the byproduct that we get by using this oxygen? So all of us eat. We had some nice sugar or food that I showed you. So the sugar in our body is used by oxygen, and it produces this byproduct called carbon dioxide. Water is another byproduct that either comes out, we can sometimes feel it in our breath, a little bit of water vapor, but water is also very useful for our body, so it can just be used by our body. And ATP, what is that? Adenosine triphosphate is the full form, and it happens to be a complex molecule. Okay, so just think of it as a molecule, but as far as the human body is concerned, and we'll talk about this as in the subsequent slides, ATP is where the energy is stored. Okay, so ATP is that, you can think of it as an energy unit in the human body. Okay, and carbon dioxide is effectively the only waste product. We do not want CO2 to build up inside our body. So that's why the CO2 is exhaled out. The carbon dioxide is exhaled out. That exchange of gases happens in the lungs. That's a whole separate activity. We can talk, you can do it later. We can talk about it later when there is that whole exchange of gases happening in the human body. Similar things happen in plants. They also happen to respire. But the difference in plants is that they make their own food, whereas we have to eat food to get our nutrition. But the respiration process, where we are converting glucose or any complex sugars, breaking it down to a simple sugar, simpler and simpler sugar, finally to glucose, glucose with oxygen giving carbon dioxide, water, and energy. This whole process that happens in our body cells is what is called respiration. Okay, so ATP, remember I told you, adenosine triphosphate. You can say it's the energy released in the respiration is stored in the form of ATP. So it's stored in as in that particular molecule. You can think of it as the energy currency of a cell. And ATP are stored in the mitochondria. So this may be another term you want to think about. The human cell or the animal cell has something called, each cell has something called mitochondria. And ATP are stored in the mitochondria of cells in plants and animals. So not just animals. Plants and animals have mitochondria in their cells, and that's where this energy molecule is stored. Okay. So just a quick question regarding what you have seen so far or understand about respiration. Breaking down of sugar leads to the release of dash gas. Okay, this process happens in the presence or absence of oxygen. We'll talk about that part slightly later. Remember how I framed the sentence. This process happens in the presence or absence of oxygen, and this process is called dash. Okay, so your first option is breaking down of sugar leads to the release of, is it carbon dioxide or oxygen? What is released in the process, breaking down of sugar? And this process happens in the presence or absence of oxygen. And this process is called what? Is it called respiration or breathing? You have 5 more seconds for this. Yeah, so we'll close the poll question there. So as we've all seen, breaking down of sugar does lead to the release of carbon dioxide gas. This process happens in the presence or absence of oxygen. And this process is called respiration, right? So it's the whole breaking down and that whole reaction, we are calling it respiration. Breathing is just a physical act of taking in air and breathing it out, okay? So what is the purpose of respiration? Here too, more than one answer may be correct. It's not to provide energy. Is it breaking down food such as starch, sugar to release energy that can be used by the living organism? Is it not to provide oxygen? Or is it converting sugar into a digestible form that can be absorbed by the bloodstream? Which is the correct option or the correct options for this particular question? I'll give you 10 more seconds for that. Yeah, so we'll close the poll now. And what are the correct options? Options B and D. Okay, so those were the ones that also seem to, say more, describe the problem very well. So breaking down of food to release energy that can be used by the living organism, that very much sounds like what a purpose of respiration could be. Converting the sugar that we have into a digestible form that can be absorbed by the bloodstream. Again, very important. And that's what's happening in our cells, and then that energy can go down the bloodstream in the form of very simple sugars or this wonderful energy molecule that we talked about, yeah, ATP. So what is happening in respiration? Remember we said presence of oxygen. So when respiration happens in the presence of oxygen, it is called aerobic respiration. And we are doing that all the time. We are breathing in air and we are using that oxygen, and the glucose that's there in the food that we eat, that's there in each cell, that is being reacting with oxygen to produce carbon dioxide and water and energy. And energy is quite a lot, very efficient way to produce energy. So a little bit of glucose or carbohydrates that we eat produces quite a lot of energy. Think about it. We eat about, depending on how old we are, between 600 and 800 grams of food a day. Okay, a lot of that is, fiber. It could be protein, it could be other vitamins and minerals, but a good amount of it happens to be what we call carbohydrates, okay, which are what break down by our digestive system into glucose eventually. And when we breathe, that produces glucose and oxygen, give out carbon dioxide and water as byproducts, would produce a lot of energy. And this is called aerobic respiration. The oxygen that we breathe is doing it. But that's not the name of your activity, is it? Anaerobic respiration. What is that? Anaerobic respiration happens in plants and it happens in animals, like respiration. Slightly different in plants and in animals. But the definition of anaerobic means it's not aerobic. So aerobic means with oxygen, anaerobic means in the absence of oxygen. So remember the question I asked 3 slides back, in the presence or absence of oxygen. So that's why it was, because in this experiment you have done and what we are talking about here, we are talking about anaerobic respiration, which happens in the absence of respiration, absence of oxygen. Okay, so in plants, what happens? Usually you have glucose, and that gets converted to alcohol and carbon dioxide and energy. Anaerobic respiration in animals, we also respire anaerobically sometimes. You will notice that when we are running or exerting ourselves a lot, we find that we get pain in our joints and suddenly you get cramps. The word cramps is because of this anaerobic respiration. So we are exerting ourselves so much that the oxygen we are breathing is not enough to meet our demands. So then what the body does is it directly breaks down the glucose and it produces this byproduct called lactic acid. And there's energy as well. Again, a small amount of energy, not as efficient as aerobic, but still it can be done in the absence of oxygen. It's that lactic acid that kind of collects between our joints that causes pain, and that's the pain we know as cramps. And that's why we get cramps when we exert ourselves too much or stretch our muscles too much. There's slight lactic acid buildup that happens in the joints or in the muscles, and that's what causes that slight pain when we have cramps. And cramps are a symptom of that little bit of anaerobic respiration that we sometimes end up doing when we are overexerted. Okay, so that's how it happens in animals. Animals produce lactic acid and energy. You have that even in things like curd that I just ate, that has a bacteria, which is an animal that's doing this job. So it produces lactic acid, lactose, and so on from the lactose in the sugar in the milk. It produces this lactic acid, and that's why the milk curdles, and you get this curd that we have. It's slightly sour because there's that little bit of acid in it, right? In plants, as we said, whether it's alcohol that's made for consumption or for even things like when we are fermenting our dosa or idli or so on, there is carbon dioxide that's released. That's the important part, and that's what makes it fluff up a batter, a lovely batter. And there is also some production of some alcohol and energy. Okay, so that's how it happens. So anaerobic respiration in our setup, which is the correct equation for the anaerobic respiration in our setup. Okay, so you have to choose between A, B, C, and D for what we did with yeast. Okay. I'll give you 10 seconds to answer that one. Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, we'll close the poll there. So in our setup, it is the first one, right, which is what we're talking about. Yeast is a type of plant. It multiplies, so it enjoys eating the sugar, and then they become larger and larger in number, and it gives out carbon dioxide and some energy. So if you're actually touching the bottle, you can feel that it becomes warmer and warmer over time. Okay, and there's some alcohol that's also produced. That's that whole process of fermentation always produces this little bit of alcohol. Okay, if you ferment for a long time, which is what happens when you are distilling or producing alcohol in large quantities, and that's the purpose of doing it, then that's what happens. Otherwise, when we're doing it here for a short time for anything like bread or for our idli dosa that we have, then a small amount of alcohol is produced. That all gets evaporates off when you're actually cooking this stuff, right? Because alcohol also happens to be extremely volatile, and the fluffiness comes from the carbon dioxide that's there. But that slight sour fermented taste, that's because of this fermentation, this anaerobic process. Okay, so in our case, it is sugar which is eaten by the yeast effectively and produces these three things: alcohol, CO2, and some energy. How do we confirm the carbon dioxide gas? We put it in the lime water. Lime water, I told you, is calcium hydroxide, because calcium oxide mixed with water, calcium hydroxide. And that turns milky because when carbon dioxide goes into calcium hydroxide, it produces this thing called calcium carbonate, which is a salt that doesn't dissolve in water, so it precipitates out as a white powder, which is nothing but chalk powder. Okay, so that is why that clear lime water turns milky when carbon dioxide enters it. Now the real life connections we've talked about, beautiful fermented dough. Okay, so that's how you make dosa or idli. Yeah. Curd or dahi or yogurt, whatever you want to call it. Mosaru is produced by, tair is produced by, doi is produced by fermentation of milk into curd, right? So the lactose, which is the sugar in the milk, is converted into curd by lactobacillus or other similar bacteria that are inserted in the curd culture. And I mean, the curd culture happens to have those, and that's why we need a little bit of a curd to make more curd, right? We need those bacteria there to make the dahi. So that's what happens in when we are fermenting milk into curd. So this last question before we go off. So let's see if you can answer this one. You have mixed and ground soaked dal and rice to make dosa batter. Okay. Then you leave it aside for a few hours. What happens to the batter when you observe it after a few hours? So this is the typical way of making dosa batter. You soak ground dal and rice. You leave it aside for a few hours. What happens when you observe it after a few hours? Is there no change? Does the dosa batter get fermented by microorganisms present in the air and the mixture and rise up? Does the dosa batter expand and rise due to the heat in the air? Or does the dosa batter level lower because the ingredients mix and dissolve? So it compresses is what the last option is saying. So you have to choose the correct answer. I'll give you 5 more seconds for that one before you go away and have your yummy dosas. Boy, doing this activity presentation made me hungry for sure. Yeah, so we'll close the poll there, and as looks quite obvious, it is option B that is the correct answer. Dosa batter gets fermented by microorganisms present in the air as well as in the dosa batter itself, and it rises up. Okay, because why does it rise up? Carbon dioxide is released, it gets trapped in the dough and it fluffs up. It's the same reason why bread in the yeast, we saw that carbon dioxide is produced when it happens inside a dough of wheat, that carbon dioxide is not able to escape fully, so it makes kind of porous holes and it bloats up. Okay, so that's why it's fluffy, it has that nice texture, it cooks very well. The dosa batter or the baked bread is because of that slight bit of fermentation that's happened. Okay, and in these kinds of fermentation, whenever we have it involving a plant, there's a little bit of alcohol also there, and that goes off when it's heated and cooked. Okay, when alcohol is required to be needed for some purpose, for example to make liquor, then of course fermenting happens for a long time and people extract that alcohol to produce drinks and so on. So that's how it happens in plants. In animals, we talked about how we get pain when lactic acid builds up. That's also because of anaerobic respiration. Now, most of us mainly do aerobic respiration, but when we do not have enough oxygen supply, we do anaerobic respiration. And in some cases, like for making curd, bread, and so on, we use that to our advantage to make this anaerobic uh, respiration. We use it for our benefit. Otherwise, in nature, it happens as a last resort when there is no oxygen there, or if the oxygen is in a smaller quantity. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed that presentation, and we will catch up with you next time. If you have any questions, you can ask them here in the chat window. My colleague will be happy to answer them for you. And if if you come up with a question later, or you have more observations, or you come up with a variation, then please share them with us on the Google Classroom or via WhatsApp, or even send us an email, and we'll be happy to get back to you and answer those questions and understand a little bit more about this wonderful process that is happening in nature all around us. Okay, sometimes in our body as well. I hope you enjoyed. Take care, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.
Hey, what are you doing?
Let me show you. What's this?